We will be talking about 3 lessons I learned from this weekend. I am on the West Coast, so I'm going live a little bit later than normal. And I am with an executive over the last couple of days. We started 2 days ago, and now we're on our third day together, or second day together. Tomorrow will be our third. And honestly, we've just been diving deep into who they are. We've been diving deep into their past, moving through the knowing framework. And the knowing framework itself is effectively the analysis and the deep dive of 3 key questions. Who was I? Who am I? And who do I want to be? And y'all, there's something so incredibly important about these 3 questions, because so much of the time we're living with this constant eyesight and vision on tomorrow, even 5 minutes from now, much less so 5 years from now. And we are constantly living in the future. And then on the other side of things, for those of us who have lost someone dear, I just know that when my brother-in-law was killed, I lived so much in the past. And I actually never wanted to move away from that. I wanted to keep him alive as close to us as possible. And so I was perpetually living in the past. So there's this dichotomy of living in the future or living in the past. And either way, we're not living in the here and now. We're not actually able to alchemize that which is in front of us, because we are not actually here. We're not actually present. And so what I want to talk about tonight is 3 lessons I've learned from this time working with a decamillionaire executive. It's been such an incredible honor to be able to sit with them in the experience of their life, looking back in the history, looking at the future, sitting in the present moment. And one of the biggest things that I've realized, the first of a couple things. The first is just the power and importance of asking questions. This is something that is near and dear to me, because that is the modality which helped me come to know myself in my own journey of knowing. And when I say even knowing myself, y'all, I intend and expect to be someone not completely different, but I expect to be someone different in a year from now. And I need to, and I want to be constantly growing and evolving. So who I am today, I fully expect that in August, September of 2026, I'll look back at Christine Marie today and hopefully with pride say, wow, look at how I've grown. Look at the gain from 25 to 26. But part of the reason in living in the present is that we take stock of, okay, here I am right now. And in order to take full stock of here I am right now, I actually need to really understand, where have I come from in order to understand where I am today. And the way that I have found personally to really come to understand my stasis, my status quo, my modus operandi is through the process of asking questions and through the pulling out and tracing of the roots. So it's almost like someone says something and you pull the thread, and then you see what unravels and you see the direction. If any of you have seen effectively visualize a sweater along with me, if you will, and there's just this little piece that's out of place and you pull on it, and then all of a sudden you just keep pulling and pulling, and then the thread ravels all the way down. You see that thread that started at the top of the sweater actually travels all the way down to the very bottom, and then it continues to go. And so this whole concept of asking questions is effectively pulling on the threads. It's effectively following the yellow brick road down to the very Genesis experience, whether that was at 5 or 15 or 25, that this mindset today, this reason why I am acting or behaving, believing something, it is tied to the genesis, the root, the origin story of the core why. And typically, most often, it's during childhood, and then it's reinforced in the years after. And so day 1 of the Knowing Intensive is really dedicated to, well, who were you? What are those core beliefs that really were established during your childhood that maybe you didn't even realize were core beliefs, but what were those core stories? And then how do they manifest today? And so again, with this whole examination during this conversation of what are those things that I learned throughout, and we're not even done. We're only kind of midway through. We still have tomorrow to go. But man, the power of asking questions. Because y'all, there were times today and yesterday when I thought we had kind of reached the end of the thread pull, and I just leaned in a little bit more. And y'all, it's not just asking questions, but it's also really paying attention to the body language and the physical response we receive from someone. So this whole exercise of asking questions, actually someone sent me a video testimonial around knowing and how they have used knowing in their business, but then also in their personal life. And this whole element of telling and sharing compelling stories of the why, the genesis story, he said not only has helped him solidify business deals and make sales, but it's also allowed for him to solidify a deeper connection and a deeper relationship with his wife. And he said his 4-year-old daughter. And he really unveiled that during that I think it was a 6-minute long testimonial video he sent of applying the process of this knowing framework, of really doing the deep dive and really leaning in, both to allow yourself to be known, but then also to know others. Taking this position of curiosity and really asking why and leaning in and wanting to know. I think that's, man, isn't that the most important thing? Isn't that what we all want? We want to be known. We want to see someone looking at us with a curiosity and an interest and love in their eyes, right? Not with a semblance of judgment, but just truly wanting to know the answer. And so in leaning in, by way of, yes, asking questions, but also paying attention to the nuance. I've received this feedback multiple times after knowing retreats. You don't let us get away with just the half-hearted answer, or you don't stop when most people would, but you keep going. And man, I think that probably the biggest reason why that's been my approach is because I want people to do that with me. And so that's allowed for this depth of connection with the executives working with, whether it's at the knowing retreat or the one-on-one knowing intensives. And what that does, y'all, is that it peels back the layers in the most beautiful way to unveil. When we think about our intelligences, I've talked about this a lot on the Knowing Show, that there are multiple intelligences: the emotional intelligence, the intellectual intelligence, the spiritual intelligence, the physical. And effectively, in so doing, in the asking of the why and the tracing of the roots and pulling the threads, we see how the genesis story for how each intelligence formulated their own kind of opinion and data, and then allowing each one to come to the table. But the questions allow for it, the question itself almost opens the door for the intelligence itself to then reveal the data. Because if we're not asking why, it's more often than not that the intelligence is knocking at the door with the data that they have to offer. So it's effectively opening the door for the boardroom of, hey, everybody come to the table, let's talk. And then the EQ comes and says, this is what I know. The IQ comes and says, this is what I know. And then we can actually make an informed decision by way of allowing everything that we know to come forward. So the first real lesson from this knowing intensive is asking questions and really leaning in, and not just paying attention to that which is said, but also leaning into the physiological responses that we can see, sense. That's why in person is so powerful. And we have the ability to do this with our kids, with our partners, in a business setting. Just watching, like, where do their eyes go? If you read, and I haven't read this, but I've sat in the room under Chris Voss, who is, one of the world's top negotiators. He worked for the FBI for a long time, and he talks in Never Split the Difference. He talks about the ability to understand and read body language. And so whether it's in person on a professional level or a personal level, the ability to ask questions and then watch, and we have to be fully engaged in order to do this well. That was one of the things that stood out to me tonight as well, is that over the last 24 hours, as I've been having this interaction with this executive, is that I can't check out. Like, that's one of the things when you're in this constant engagement, is staying activated and allowing my own intelligences to inform me, but then also being so present to pull forth. We're talking, this actually happened, it was probably around 6 p.m. tonight. We were really starting to make like a good rhythm and good connection. We were talking about the professional, We were talking about leadership and how they show up with their team. Yet it was so interesting because the way that they were showing up in terms of the leadership style actually had roots and kind of, you can say, a relationship with the emotional level on the personal side from childhood. And we what we landed on, and in exploring, we really actually went through the timeline of their life and really understanding what was the transition from boyhood to manhood, and when did that happen, and what were the narratives that were informing that change in you at one of the most critical times of your life during this transition from boyhood to manhood. And what were the narratives being spoken to you? What were the narratives you actually interpreted about the world during this time? And how does that show up today in your own boardroom as you're engaging with your employees? And it was so interesting, y'all, because if we don't understand our own intelligences and how each one plays a part, we have to have every single one activated, or else one is going to be so much louder than the others. And over the last 3 years, I've really switched on my emotional intelligence. That was dead, dormant. It was completely inactive for about 28 years of my life, until 28 when my husband left. And I just, man, I had to go deep, and I had to go into this, like, I effectively had to turn the other intelligences, I had to like dim them down a little bit because the EQ was just so quiet and I had no access to my emotions. And so I kind of had to turn up that volume a little bit, even in a disproportionate way. But I knew that I was doing it with intention so that I could tune into this new type of input that I had never received before in my life. Here's the thing. I had received it, but I had never honored it. And so therefore it went quiet. And so in kind of turning up the input of the emotional intelligence over the years, it's allowed for me to then, okay, now I can start turning up my IQ a little bit more. Here I can turn up the spiritual intelligence a little bit more. And now I have the entire boardroom activated. And the intelligence that I'm actually working on the most right now is the physical intelligence. Funny enough, I was, speaking with a male executive today, and he really is working on now getting in touch with his physical intelligence, getting in touch with, what is my body telling me? And y'all, this is critical, because what he's experiencing now by way of silencing his physical intelligence is like actual literal sickness in his body. His body is literally like revolting against him because he's never actually taken the time to listen to what it says. But what we did over over our time together thus far is identify that with every step towards honoring that, what his body is telling him, it starts to get healthier and it's starting to heal. But it's only by way, same with my emotional intelligence. The more I actually tuned in and turned up the volume of the emotional intelligence, all of a sudden I started to come to like this peace internally, but I had never accessed it before. So it was like, okay, I can experience peace if I just stuff it all away, but God forbid it ever comes back. So for example, with my brother-in-law being killed, I just stuffed it all away. I was so, oh gosh, the grief was the things that I wrote in my journal that no one ever read. It was so devastating going back and reading from like 2016, 2015. It was so isolating, the amount of emotional pain I was in, and no one had any idea, because technically it was my sister who lost her husband. So who am I to gripe and complain around my loss when it wasn't, I wasn't the one that really truly was impacted. It was my sister and her 3-week-old baby girl who lost her daddy, and she lost her husband. So why should I complain? But in so doing, I isolated myself. I didn't get the support I needed. And then I literally numbed out in all the other areas of my life, so that when my husband ended up leaving me, I was like, whoa, like I had to come to terms with the fact that I even feel it. I feel discomfort in my stomach even now saying this. After I went to therapy, I actually apologized to my husband, and I said, I'm so sorry for never healing from the loss of my brother-in-law. And he didn't, I think he had already mentioned one time that he wasn't sure he wanted to stay. So it wasn't like we were in a great relationship anyways. But I apologized to him because I still will never fully know how my emotional numbness impacted our marriage. And then, when he left, I had to reconcile with, okay, who's the person looking back at me in the mirror? But man, y'all, it's so incredibly important that we actually do the work to reconcile with the person in the mirror and the intelligence that we potentially have neglected for the years past. And so for me, it was the emotional intelligence that had been far neglected. And now I'm looking at my physical intelligence, and I'm even starting to see myself, like when I'm not paying attention to my emotions, or I'm not paying attention to even what my physical body needs, like sleeping enough. I'm starting to see the physical ramifications of that. I won't go down that rabbit hole. I'll come back to this. So the second lesson that I learned from the Knowing Intensive retreat for this executive this weekend, I actually wrote down on my notes just to keep me focused. So there's always a deeper why. That really stood out to me during our time, was that there were times when I thought we had effectively gotten to the end, and it was like, okay, we're here, we arrived. But again, with kind of paying attention to the physiological responses of that person, it was really helpful, like leaning in even further and just being quiet. And that's a hard one for me. It's really hard for me to just sit in the silence and wait for them, because growing up, so I'm the fourth in the line of 6 kids, and my parents very much so helped me learn that I was the bridge between the youngers and the olders, and it was kind of my job to keep everybody happy, and that was the role that I filled, and that's the role where I found value, and that's the role that I stepped into and walked in order to receive the love that I wanted and the connection with everyone in the family. So I played this role of effectively being the jokester, being the caretaker, being my grandmother told my mom when my mom was pregnant with me, like, your daughter, I just have a feeling like God told me that your daughter's going to be like Mother Teresa. And so when I was 4, my mom told me that I was supposed to be Mother Teresa. So I took on this role and this persona. Thank God there's only one Mother Teresa in the world, and there's only one Christine Marie in the world. But for so long, I lived my life modeled after this saint, and it was impossible to keep up with the saint. But I tried. And so for so long, I was constantly filling in the gap and filling in the silence with my own opinion, my own desire to make someone happy, taking action rather than letting someone sit in the discomfort of their own pain, or just letting them sit and try to figure it out themselves. I really wanted to be the savior, which actually is kind of, when we think about masculine and feminine, I'm not talking about male or female, but there's a very masculine and feminine type of way that we can manifest. And feminine is like very tender, very caring, but then the masculine can be very organized, very efficient, very task oriented. And so what I did, and even now as I'm talking about this, I just kind of realized, like, my feminine came out in a very masculine way, which was, oh, I'm going to take care of you in a very structured way, and this is how you need to be cared for, rather than listening, and rather than waiting in the stillness and then the silence. And the more that I'm interacting with different individuals, the more I'm seeing that, there's a discomfort in their pain. And I learned this so keenly with my sister when she lost her husband. It was so uncomfortable to not do anything and not be able to do anything. And actually, there were times, to my shame, I actually retreated. I actually removed myself from the discomfort of the situation because I didn't believe my mere presence was enough. I didn't think that because I couldn't offer any help, I literally was like, well, it's probably better for me to just be gone, rather than recognizing that people just, man, to just sit with someone. There's this biblical, they talk about it in the Bible, this concept of sitting in the ashes with someone. And actually, I think it's of the Jewish custom, Shiva. I've only been to one, but it was right around the time when someone passes. Shiva is effectively the practice, the Jewish tradition of going and sitting with someone in their grief. And I think it's so incredibly important because most Western traditions, or most Western culture rather, doesn't have a real tradition around grief. And it's so awkward and it's so uncomfortable and we don't know what to do. So we just hightail it out of there and leave and extricate ourselves because we can't do anything. And the other side of that is that we don't place enough value in our being to then just go and sit with them in their grief. And we actually make it be about us. Well, I don't have a place here. This is uncomfortable for me and I can't do anything. Everything about those sentiments was all about me. I can't do anything. Rather than I'm just going to show up. What do they need? Let me, again, paying attention to the physiological responses of somebody. Oh gosh, it is so, even now after I lost my brother-in-law, it's like, I will forever remember who was there. I will forever remember who sent me messages, not only during that week, but in the months and years after, around the anniversary, who remembers. That really, y'all, that means so, 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 so much. So in this second lesson from the Knowing Founder Intensive, really just sitting with the person and waiting in the quiet and just giving them space to come to their own answer. I think that was something that was hard because I had opinions, I had thoughts, I had creative solutions, and just waiting and just letting them think and asking the question and remaining curious. I think that's even a lesson in and of itself, being curious, asking the question and letting their answer be different than what I thought it might be. And y'all, I need to come back and watch this when I come to be a parent because I know it's going to be so hard for me with my children. If I ask a question or I ask them about their day, or if I ask them about a lesson that maybe I have an end goal of, I'm actually asking them a question with the hopes that they'll arrive, at point B. But man, isn't it such a beautiful thing to get to know people? And it's only truly through curiosity, through love, that we create the space for them to come to know the truth for themselves, because I want to know them. And isn't that the truth? If we truly want to know them, then we cannot come forth with our own assumptions. We cannot come forth with our own preconceived notions. We have to proceed with the triad of love and curiosity and compassion, and just allow for it to unveil itself and them to unveil themselves. And together we explore who they are. And so the third real lesson from today, I love this one. The end result effectively is shaped through the progress itself and the process. We had an interesting moment tonight. Where they were fully expecting. We actually were so close to getting to like hitting their vision on the head. Like, this is what you're supposed to do for the rest of your life. We were so close. And we were like inches away, and we both came to a moment, and it was like, you know what? We need to take a pause. It's not it. It's like 90% there or 95% there, but it's just not quite it. And as we were talking, I just had this sense of, my own journey of coming to know myself, just doing it for me. That process is where I ended up realizing that is the very thing to which I am called. And so if I'm so fixated on what am I called to? How am I supposed to spend the rest of my life? I'm actually going to miss the very process that I need to move through for me that will effectively show me that which I'm called to. And so with all these other, I don't want to say all these other areas of our lives, but specifically in regards to the thing to which we're called. If I'm not the person that I need to be to execute that calling, then why would I ever expect it to make itself known to me? Why would I? And maybe we do. Maybe, I'm sure that happens for some folks, that they're, 40 years old, 30 years old, 25 years old, and they know that is the change that I'm going to make in the world. Okay, now let me go become that person in order to go make that change. But so often it is in the becoming process that the change in and of itself begins to unfold. And so if we're so fixated on the end result, we're not going to allow for the maturation in the process, the growth in the process, the healing in the process. And it is, and I hate this because I want to get to the end result, but I'm realizing that it is literally in the process, in the molding and in the shaping and in the fire itself, as we're molded, that we become that which we need for ourselves to then serve others. And man, I heard this years ago and I didn't really understand it until I went through further breaking, so to say. But effectively, it's who do I need right now? What are the problems that I have right now? And effectively, how do I become the person that I need? How do I become the solution to my own problems? And thus, that's likely the solution that I'll provide to everyone else. And so, rather than constantly outsourcing our solutions to our problems, rather than constantly outsourcing not even just our own solutions to our problems, but also our beliefs. We talk about that too here on the Knowing Show. It's of how much of our intelligences, our spiritual intelligence, intellectual, emotional, physical, how much of that is actually ours to begin with. How much of that has actually been outsourced, and we have not come to develop our own and strengthen our own fundamental core beliefs about each one of these areas. So, in summary, or I guess not necessarily in summary, but just to wrap this up, one of the things that we've been working on throughout today is establishing what is your current baseline? What is your baseline of health, of your goals, of the narratives, of the strengths and weaknesses? Let's do a SWOT analysis for every single core area of your life. Intelligences, yes, and also so we dove into the emotional baseline, the financial baseline, the professional. How do you show up in the boardroom with your employees, with your team, with your partners? How are you showing up with your family? So we analyzed every single area of his life, because only when we acknowledge the baseline does the gunshot fire, and now we can start to move towards our ideal. But we have to establish our status quo. And so often we actually need to change the status quo at incremental levels before we can then even be on the pathway to the ideal. Because if we've got, I used this analogy earlier today when I was working with him. If we know kind of the neutral baseline, like at least let me be neutral. But if I'm steeped in unhealth in one of these categories, then to move from unhealth all the way to my ideal is moving from negative 25 to 100. Let me at least move from negative 25 to 0. Now we're at a neutral starting point. Now the gunshot fires, and now we can at least start moving in incremental steps to our ideal. But if we are below the baseline, if we are in the negatives beneath 0, then we have got so much further to go, and it's so much more difficult to actually make good progress. So if we were to take something away from this conversation, the asking of questions, the curiosity, the love, and the compassion, and this is why I love the word compassion. Compassion is effectively empathy tied with action. And y'all, if we do not take time to experience empathy for ourselves, which we don't really talk about, we talk about empathy for other people, but empathy for ourselves and the environment in which we were raised, what we were handed, allowing gratitude 100%, but then also a great deal of empathy of just like, wow, that was hard. That's really, really challenging that I was handed that lot, whatever that lot is. But if we only are looking at ourselves with judgment, it's going to be that much harder to make any real progress. And so if we exchange judgment with curiosity, coupled with gratitude, with love, compassion is empathy with action. Then we can start making forward progression. So 1, looking at ourselves with curiosity, love, compassion, asking questions, and then really allowing us to then analyze, what is my baseline? Where am I actually beneath 0 in the negative, in unhealth? And the categories that we analyzed were family, socially, relationally, socially in terms of just like friends, and then relationally in regards to, those core deep relationships in our lives, whether that's mentors, whether that's with our partners, and then also looking at it from a professional level, financially as well, and then honestly, the physical, the fitness, the health, wellness. That's such a core category. I've been really leaning into this over the last couple of weeks, and it continuously shocks me how almost 50% of our life goes to our physical well-being. We spend 7 to 8 hours a night sleeping, 2 hours a day eating, prepping food, maybe let's say an extra hour of the day in the gym, maybe another hour in the day relieving ourselves and tending to like personal items. Y'all, that's 10 to 12 hours every single day. That is half of our lives go to this physical self. And yet we hardly ever take time to really assess, well, how am I feeling? Do I actually feel good? Am I really truly nourishing myself? So when we analyze what is the baseline of every single one of these core areas of my life, where am I below baseline? Where am I starting at zero? Where am I actually above the baseline? Where am I really, really thriving? And then analyzing it against our ideal. And then from there, now the gunshot fires, and now we can start making true incremental progress in our lives. So with that,